Welcome, everybody. We have Chris Parsons on the show, Brain Health, Unchaining Your Pain. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thank you, Ruth. It's nice to be here.
So it's an absolute pleasure to have you on my show. I know you've got an amazingly poignant story to tell from your experience in the context of brain health. But before we start, just introduce you, and I'd love you to tell people a little bit about yourself, who you are and what you do. So Chris is passionate about mental health and well-being. He suffered from a serious mental health issue himself, and he's very much aware of the stigma that surrounds the topic, and his aim here is to reduce the stigma so that mental ill health is treated exactly the same as physical ill health. And in 2018, Chris completed an intensive program of psychotherapy at Regent's University in London. He's also a trustee of MQ Mental Health, and he's been a lawyer at Herbert Smith Freehills for 36 years, and he's chairman of their India practice for the last 16. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Ruth.
So for the listeners, I know we've given quite a long introduction, but could you just tell people, for those that don't know you, who you are and who you serve?
Who I am, and sorry, what was the other one?
Who you serve?
Who I serve.
Yeah.
And what do you mean by serve?
So who you support? So from a client perspective, obviously you work in the India practice, and who you support in the context of mental health.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So look, yeah, I'm a lawyer by training. I've been at the same firm as you said, Ruth, for 36 years now, and also, as you said, I've spent the last 16 years as chairman of our India practice, and what that is involved is being principally looking after Indian clients, doing transactions outside of India, around the world, and also looking after international clients doing things in India. One of the nice things, one of the great exports of the UK is English law, and many of those transactions are governed by English laws, which is why we have a role. And then separately, as a result of the struggles that I've had over many years, I have a real and deep interest in mental well-being, and I speak to organizations around the world about what they can do better to look after their people, and what people can do better to look after themselves. And I went public with my struggles in 2015, and since then I've made it a really important part of my mission to try and help people understand what mental ill health looks like, and how we can look after each other and ourselves.
And I think it's such an important topic, particularly given the state of the nation and the state of the world at the moment in these present times, and the difficulty that people have been having for a whole variety of reasons. Because this show is all about brain health, what does optimal brain health mean for you personally? And there's not a right or wrong question, it's different for everyone.
Yeah, look, I mean, I like to think very much of my mental health a bit like my physical health, and I'll often say to people, look, I'm sure on a scale of 1 to 100, you could tell me sort of what your physical health looks like, and perhaps it's a little bit more difficult with your mental health, but I think it's good to think of it on that sort of scale. So you know, where am I? And when I know that I'm in a good place, in other words, my mental health is more towards 100 than it is to 0, it simply means that I can just be more efficient in what I'm doing. So, for example, if I've got a complicated speech to write, or a document to produce, or some views to express, I know when I'm in a good place because I can do the research, I can read up, I can understand it, I can formulate what I want to say to people really quickly and without too much struggle. And the flip side of that, of course, is when you're not in a good place, you'll often read things and not understand them clearly. You might even read them 2 or 3 times and not understand them. It also means that I'm sleeping well when my brain's in a good place, and I'm just enjoying day-to-day stuff that we can all enjoy, whether it's watching TV with my wife, whether it's listening to some music, whether it's taking the dogs for a walk, whether it's having a meal with friends. So it's that for me, which would indicate that my brain is in a good place. My brain is in a healthy place.
Do you know, I really love the way you discussed that, because you covered all 4 quadrants of well-being that I talk about from a brain health perspective. So we talk about emotional well-being is how we feel. Our physical well-being is what we're doing, bringing us joy and feeling purposeful. Our mental well-being, which is that clarity of thought and focus and ability to think clearly. And then we have our spiritual well-being, which is living with passion and purpose, and also that important connection to ourselves and to other people. So I love that you covered all of those 4 quadrants. It's so important that we look at all 4 and not just at one of them. So I'd love to explore, based on those 4 quadrants, in your story, and we're going to go into in some depth, but when did you notice what of those aspects that you've just described was really rock bottom for you? When did you notice that you were in a really dark place?
In a way, Ruth, it's difficult to answer that, in the sense that because of our sort of life experiences, we have a sort of a level of where we are at a current time. And of course, sometimes it's difficult to know whether the place in which you are is an acceptable place. I often hear people say to me, look, I'm working really hard at work. I'm not sleeping so well. It's a stressful, I've got a stressful job, but isn't that how everyone is? Isn't that the sort of, the base level that we all have to put up with? So I think my starting point is sometimes it's difficult to assess clearly whether you're in a bad place or not. But having said that, in the end, actually, my body voted for me. So it wasn't like I made a conscious decision and acknowledged that I was in a bad place. My body simply gave up. So part of my story is very high levels of anxiety and stress at work. I used to cycle to work for 20 years in London, and for many of the mornings before I set off for work, I used to pray that I would be knocked off my bike, because I wanted a physical reason not to go to work rather than the mental health reason. So I clearly realized that there were things that weren't quite right. I think we can all accept that it's not normal to want to be knocked off your bike, so you have to go to work. And then I would self-medicate with alcohol. That's another big part of my story. So I would drink most evenings to alleviate that stress and anxiety.
I can really relate to that, by the way, because that was part of my story too, is that self-medication. And for me, it crept up on me, and you get to half a bottle a night, or whatever the volume is, but it starts off can start off quite innocently, and then develop into a problem.
Yeah, which it unquestionably did with me. Although, as you said, it's a progressive thing, but it's clear to me that and again, it would be difficult to pinpoint the moment, but there's no doubt that I then misused alcohol. It became something that started controlling me rather than me controlling it, and I am an alcoholic, albeit in remission, thankfully, but even so. And so then, of course, I had 2 problems rather than one: a sort of mental health issue around stress, anxiety, and depression on the one hand, and alcoholism on the other. And as I said, my body really made the decision for me, because I just really kept on pushing and pushing and pushing and trying to pretend there wasn't an issue. And I went down to the gym one evening. It was in 1996, so a long time ago now, when I had my first major, what can only be described as a mental breakdown. I went to the gym, I collapsed. I was just about able to get my clothes back on. I got a taxi home. I was rushed to hospital. I had every single test imaginable done. And at the end of all of those tests, I was told by the senior doctor, Mr. Parsons, there's nothing wrong with you, which was, the sort of, it may sound odd, but it was the last thing I wanted to hear. I desperately wanted something to be able to point at, to say, look, this is how I feel. I could tell friends and family and work, this is how I was. But of course, because there was nothing physically wrong with me, it only left a mental health issue. And I then, fell into a very, very deep depression from which at the time I thought I would never emerge from. So that was really the start of my body saying to me, physically, you just can't do this anymore. You're going to need to make some adjustments. And I made some adjustments, but probably not sufficient, because I had subsequent episodes of depression. And it was only really at a later stage when I made a really very radical reassessment of my life and my approach to life that actually I properly started to get better.
Dr. Gabon Mate, thank you for sharing that. Dr. Gabon Mate has written a phenomenal book called When the Body Says No. And this is very much about us not acknowledging that we have trauma in our mind, and we think we can carry on and not deal with it and not address it. And actually, when we ignore the emotions that come from our childhood, often where it originates, and we suppress them, our emotions are a signal telling us to do something, to move away from pain and to move towards gain, typically. And by suppressing them, they're still there, and you're ending up turning up the volume more, because your mind is saying, no, we need to do something about this. And when you keep suppressing them, which sounds like what happened for yourself, your body takes on the brunt of the emotional trauma that you're experiencing, and ultimately your body says no, which is in essence what you've just described there. So for your journey, I know you mentioned, you ended up with struggling with addiction, which is a consequence of your self-medication approach, and then also the symptoms of depression. But it all stems from trauma, doesn't it, from your past? Would you be able to describe what that is for those that don't know?
Yeah, of course. And you mentioned in the introduction that I sit on the board of MQ Mental Health Research, which is the leading mental health research charity in the UK. And through that, I've learned that actually those of us who go on to struggle with mental ill health, the seeds are very often sown in childhood, as you rightly said. And in fact, I think actually the data I've read suggests that 75% of us that go on to struggle, the seeds are sown in childhood. So it's a common feature, and it reminds me, of course, is the enormous responsibility that we have as parents in terms of the way we can impact our children. And so my story involved really my mum and my dad. My dad loved my mum, my mum until the day he died 3 years ago. And but where he struggled was when children came along, and it's something that would go on to repeat itself, because it's something I recognize myself. But I think the heart of it, and I never discussed this with him, but the heart of it was that the emotional energy that my mum would give to her children, in particular me being the eldest child and male. I think that was an issue as well. Meant that he was excluded, and I believe he suffered from jealousy, significant jealousy, as a result of that. And because of that jealousy, he found me difficult. And I think I've said, at best I was an irritant, and at worst I was somebody who he could not wait to leave home, and he couldn't help himself but show that, both verbally and sort of emotionally. So, it felt like every day he made me cry, but it can't have been, but that is one of my sort of abiding memories. I used to spend a lot of time in my bedroom, frankly, keeping out of his way, but it did mean that I turned into a bit of a swot. So I used to read a lot. I used to do homework. I would listen to music, etc. And because I just didn't want to be anywhere near him, because it was dangerous to be near him. If you were in the bathroom, or if I was in the bathroom when he wanted to use it, all hell would be sort of released. You didn't want to be near him at breakfast time. He was normally a bit calmer by the evenings. The mornings were terrible. My friends wouldn't come to the house because they regarded him as a difficult man, emotionally very volatile, and they were frightened to come to the house. And then there were separate issues with my mum as well. And so in a way, I had this sort of perfectly awful packaging, dysfunctional packaging, when I was released out into the wild, released out to school, university, and at work, because I viewed the world as a very difficult, dangerous place. The place where I was meant to be safe and contented at home was not a good place, and was a frightening place. I have another very distinct memory where I used to go and stay with my maternal grandmother, who I loved deeply. And in fact, my paternal grandparents as well, I also had a fantastic relationship with. But I remember one particular episode. I was sitting at the top of the stairs of my grandmother's house. I don't know how old I would have been, maybe sort of 7 or 8. And I could hear my parents downstairs, and they were coming to collect me. And I can just remember sobbing because I didn't want to leave, because I felt safe with my grandmother. But didn't feel safe being taken home, and so I viewed the world with enormous anxiety and worry, and that clearly was going to have a significant impact on my day-to-day life, and it was why, to begin with, at least, alcohol became the answer, because of course it did the job that I wanted it to do. It made me relax. It made me feel all right. It made me forget about the worries of the world. And so, which is why I think so many alcoholics find it incredibly difficult to give up, because they too think of alcohol as the answer. And as long as you think of it as the answer, the last thing you want to do is to give it up, which is why it took me decades to recognize that whilst it worked for me sometimes, the consequences were increasingly awful, and therefore it was only.
How did you manage? Obviously, as a thank you for sharing, and I hear a lot of people talk about their childhood trauma and how they used their intellect to escape, because if you can't escape your surroundings, and I've done this myself, the only way you can escape is into your mind. And obviously you can't escape your emotional mind, because that's the bit that's really fired up. So you seek to use your cognitive aspects as your escape tool to deal with the emotional aspects and the external lack of safety that you have in your surroundings, your environment. How did your dad make you feel as a child? Were you able to connect with those emotions that you were feeling later on once you were able to go through the support that you got to get yourself to where you are today?
So I got on better with my dad once I'd left home, because I was no longer a threat, and actually he was enormously proud of what I'd achieved. And through that, actually, I learned probably some other unhelpful lessons, which were that sort of love was conditional, so that he was prepared to accept me and to acknowledge me, etc. Once I'd left home and become successful. So I think I constantly got this unhelpful sense that in order to be validated, I needed to do something. I needed to be something. I needed to be successful. I needed to be validated through doing something positive, rather than simply being worthwhile, of value in myself. And I think the closest we ever got to revisiting how things had been at home was actually, interestingly, I did go and stay with them after I was sort of recovering through my first bout of depression. And that's interesting, isn't it? That even though I had challenges, I did go back and stay with them. And I remember we were sitting in a pub in West Wales. And I think I said something like, I was on medication at this stage, and I was having some counselling, and I think I said something like, "Oh, the counsellor has explained to me that a lot of the challenges that we face later in life are because of stuff that's happened during our childhood." And two things happened. One, my mum burst into tears and said, "Please never tell me how that was for you." So she clearly had a deep sense that things weren't right, and she almost couldn't bear to hear what they were, because she didn't feel, it felt like she wasn't strong enough to carry what that might have meant. And separately, my dad just looked at me and said, "I wasn't a very good dad, was I?" And that was the only acknowledgement that he ever made. I obviously, I didn't say that he was rubbish, but I was obviously thinking that. But nor did I try and make light of it. I didn't say, "Oh no, there was nothing." I simply left it. And I think I subsequently grew to learn, probably indirectly through my mum, that my dad had struggled as a child, and father had been incredibly tough on him, so his role model was awful. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that actually that my dad, the reason he behaved like he did was because of his upbringing, and frankly, his had been really dysfunctional. So it was simply life repeating itself, which is also an incredibly sad thing to see, these sort of generational issues repeating themselves, and they need ideally to be broken. The chain of problem needs to be broken.
And we can break them because our brains are so malleable. So when we can change the environment and change the behaviors that we're expressing, and understand the root cause of those behaviors, the root cause, the emotions, the epigenetics, like you've just expressed, it is possible to change, because our genes only load the gun. It's the environment that pulls the trigger. So if we make sure that we create a nurturing environment for our children going forward, even if we've been in a destructive one, then we don't have to carry that on to generations to come. And I think that's what's so wonderful as an opportunity for us from a brain health perspective, is that we can change the status quo, we can change the outcome for the future. So I know you mentioned for yourself that you used education and to help you get through, and actually it became your kind of, it seems that it's become your mission, and the thing that has defined your success is is leveraging your ultimately was your survival mechanism at the time, which was escaping into study, has now become what's your passion and purpose. Would you say that's right, or has that evolved differently?
Yeah, no, I would say there's no doubt that I would say that my primary purpose now feels like a desire to share with people some of the issues around mental well-being, to explain to people how incredibly common it is, to reinforce that it's life-threatening, so that it can take you to a place in which you don't want to be around anymore. And I certainly had the notion that I wanted to go to sleep and never wake up. And to talk to organizations about how they can make the work environment more constructive, more open, more supportive, more helpful, in order to help people, and separately how we as individuals can go about, looking after ourselves better. And so I would say that was, I would regard that now as my primary purpose in life. Of course, we have a whole bunch of other stuff, and I remain passionate about India, where until lockdown I was spending 2 weeks every month, and I spent a lot of time learning about India, reading about India, about its people, its cultures, its caste system, its language, its food, its geography, etc. But I would say my primary purpose now feels like a sort of mission around mental well-being and trying to make a difference in that space.
And I think that's wonderful. And I know that you have had a huge amount of support from your firm in order to help you through the recovery process. And you mentioned that you went through your first bout of depression, was several years ago, many years ago now. Could you describe, for those that don't know, could you describe what happened and what sort of support you got at the time that was really crucial for you to get through that really difficult period?
Yeah, look, so at a personal level, it involved initially going to the GP, and the GP being clear that I needed psychiatric help and support. And there was a discussion around whether medication would help. I am of the view, and remain of the view, that for some of us, medication is an incredibly important part of our recovery. And I have been on different forms of antidepressants pretty much since 1996. There have been 1 or 2 periods where I came off under medical guidance and actually became depressed again. So it seems like there is a genuine chemical imbalance in my brain, whether it's around serotonin or noradrenaline or whatever other chemicals might be relevant to my brain. So that was a critical part, coupled with some counseling. And so back in 1996, nobody was talking about mental health, and certainly not in a work context. And so the narrative at work was that Chris had been overdoing it and needed to recharge his batteries, whereas the truth, of course, is that I had as full and complete a mental breakdown as I certainly would ever want to experience, and was very ill. And I remember the psychiatrist saying to me, "Look, Chris, you should think of this as if you'd had the equivalent of a major heart attack, and you're going to need to recover in the way that recognizes that, and you're going to need to care for yourself and look after yourself and make some adjustments and go back to work carefully and slowly," all of which was absolutely incredibly important advice. And so, the thing I think I would say most about work, because then in subsequent episodes, I became more emboldened and was willing to use the word depression. And I have to say, work was absolutely fantastic. Once I went into the head of corporate and I said, look, my depression seems to have come back. I'm not in a good place. And they sent me home immediately, which is exactly what I needed, what I wanted, what I was desperate for. And on one or two other occasions, I simply phoned into the office and said, look, I'm not well again. And again, the response was just wonderfully supportive. You've been here before, Chris. You know best how to sort of support and look after yourself. Mm-hmm. And for me, the most important message was, please don't feel, number one, don't worry about work. We'll get it covered. Do not look at your emails. Don't do any of that sort of stuff, which again was just this enormous relief that I wasn't sort of expected to somehow do some sensible handover and to monitor my emails. So I just needed to be told everything's fine, let go. I needed to let go. And then separately, what I found incredibly helpful was, Chris, you don't need to report into us on a regular basis. Don't feel the pressure to say, every other day, I'm up, I'm down, I'm not really sure. So basically for me, what worked best was just, Chris, you know what support you need. You've got your family and friends around you. We're here if you need us. So if you need to contact us, you need to speak to, the firm doctor or whatever it might be, we're here for you, but don't feel that you need to report in. You let us know when you're ready to re-engage. And that, again, was the most perfect way of looking after me. Because I never felt the responsibility to, try and work out how I was on a given day and what report I should be giving. So it was really just once I'd started to emerge from the blackness that I could then say, look, I genuinely think I'm sort of on the road to recovery. The medical advice is that perhaps within 4 weeks I can sort of restart work. And then the final piece was an acceptance that you couldn't go from being off and seriously unwell through to then going back to a full-time position. And I needed to re-engage. So I think, the first week I probably worked 3 mornings from home. Mm-hmm. And it built up, but it built up based on how I was feeling rather than the firm putting any pressure on me. So in all of those respects, I'm enormously indebted to my firm.
I had a very different experience coming back to it. For me, is I was expected to travel into the London office when the closest office from a travel perspective was half an hour away, and it was expected for me to do a 2-hour journey to come into work for 4 hours and then travel another 2 hours to go home, for me to fulfill my commitment, which created an enormous amount of additional stress when I was already acutely stressed. So I think it's wonderful that your workplace was very accommodating to, and you were in the driving seat, which I think is really wonderful, that you could tell them, okay, this works for me, this doesn't work for me. How is that manifested within the organization? I know you mentioned it initially, when you first had your bout of depression, it wasn't something that we talked about, but nowadays we're much more open, or we're seeking to be more open and remove that stigma. How has that changed the conversations that people have within their workplace, and also from a legal perspective? Because we know lawyers work incredibly hard, and this particular sector isn't devoid of people struggling. How has that changed the conversations that have in the workplace?
Look, we and I don't claim any credit for this at all. We've got a whole bunch of people who are working in diversity and inclusion who are incredibly focused on our whole wellbeing initiatives. And so I think as an organization that we've made really big and important steps forward. Yeah, look, I'm extremely proud of what the firm has achieved. And actually, probably the most important thing that I would share, sorry, just to back up one moment. So one of the criticisms, one of the few criticisms, if you like, of me coming out in 2015 and talking about the struggles that I'd had, talking about my brokenness, talking about my mental health issues and my related addiction, and the fact that the firm had been so supportive. A completely legitimate point that was made to me, actually by a number of the associates that I was very close to, some of the more junior people within the organization, said to me, look, Chris, it's all right for you because you've been at the firm for so many years. You've sort of earned your goodwill, you've earned your badge of trust, and therefore the firm was willing to accommodate and make allowances for somebody who had been at the firm for so long and hopefully had added some value over that time. And I found it difficult to answer that question until more junior people were willing to come out and to share their stories, because it was only once we had people in business services, secretaries, people working in finance, associates, sort of senior, middle, and junior associates and trainees. It was only once they felt sufficiently comfortable that in telling their stories, one, that they would be taken seriously, and two, that they genuinely considered that those disclosures would not impact adversely on their careers, was I able to say, look, we have genuinely now built a culture in which there is a much better understanding and acceptance that people will from time to time struggle with mental ill health because it's very common. And so that was really the breakthrough moment for me. And so what I encourage other organizations to do is to find some champions, and there are many champions within Herbert Smith Freehills of mental well-being, to talk out publicly about it, and to seek with the senior leadership to build a culture in which people feel sufficiently confident to share their stories in a way that isn't going to affect their ongoing careers.
I think, I think that's so important, because there are many people who feel that need to bury their struggles because of the fear factor associated with, well, what will happen if I tell my story? What will happen if I tell the truth, in terms of my security, from a job perspective, from a physical perspective, all of the aspects that we worry about, relationships perspective. How is that going to change the relationships that I have with the people in the organization? Are they going to view me differently? Am I going to be assigned a label? And that's certainly what I was very conscious of. Is it seemed to be commonplace for the firm I was in for people to be off sick with stress, and it wasn't a badge of honor. It felt like a badge of shame that you didn't have the resilience. They talk about a lot about resilience training, and I think it's really important that people do create the right culture within the workplace where people can have open discussions about how they're feeling, about what they're struggling with, even if it's not work related, because we all bring our home life to work, whether we like it or not, and we take our work life home with us. We're all now in the same space often, that we can talk about what our struggles are, whether that's from a mental health perspective, or we have family members who may be struggling with other brain health struggles, such as Alzheimer's disease. Lyme's disease is another classic that can lead to depression. There's all sorts of different struggles that we can experience from a brain health perspective, and creating that culture to be open and honest about it, I think is really important. And I know you mentioned that for yourself, you were able to overcome these struggles that you had through a lot of support and a lot of deep work for yourself, and you're still on medication to help you manage the your mindset as well. What one piece of advice would you say to anyone that's really struggling with their brain health, whether that's mental ill health or anything else, and they're struggling to talk about it, to get the help they need? What would you say to somebody?
Yeah, well, look, the thing, whenever I'm asked, what would I do differently? The key, I think, is that I should have asked for help earlier, and of course, we need to do that in a way that is right for us. So I'm not suggesting for a moment that it's right for everyone that they should go out and publicly declare their their challenges to their organization or to the world, as I've ultimately done now. But to find people that they trust and respect, and to share their struggles, and that in itself, of course, as you'll know, Ruth, is an incredibly helpful start to be able to share how you're feeling, and then separately, to get professional advice. And so, that's the other key piece to this. I mean, interestingly, I think for some people, they can make a full and complete recovery, as you will know, Ruth. And then for others, there will need to be a fairly radical reassessment of their life. And I fell into that category of having to make a pretty radical reassessment and to change things significantly for me to get to the place that I'm in at the moment. And of course, I remember I did a 5-week program at Regent's University, sponsored by the firm, again, fantastically supportive, sponsored by the firm. And the lecturer, I remember saying there, is that, we're all work in progress, and will remain work in progress until the day we die. And I will be the first to admit that that I still need a lot of help and support, and to be very mindful about how my history catches up with me from time to time, and I can turn from the sort of rational, calm, thinking human being into that sort of emotional human being that is struggling with the way they're feeling, and but also to know that that's just a fact, and it's something that will be with me, forever.
Well, I just want to say thank you, Chris, for sharing your story. I know it's been a very difficult journey for yourself, and it's wonderful that you're able to tell it now, and help others be able to have the voice for themselves to go and ask for help. What is next for you on your mission?
Well,
how can people get hold of you?
Yeah, look, I mean, please, if people would like to, send me an invite on LinkedIn or anything like that, because I'm often posting stuff on mental wellbeing, please do. No, I'm hoping to start a degree. I plan to start a master's in psychotherapy next April at Regent's University. And in due course, I hope to become a registered psychotherapist. So I'll be starting my second career in due course. Although a lot of people have suggested that I've been through a number of different careers within Herbert Smith Freehills. So maybe it's about my 4th or 5th career. So anyway, it's something I'm enormously looking forward to.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Brain Health, Unchaining Your Pain. I wish you every success in your future.
I really hope you enjoyed that conversation. Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to like and share this episode, and leave a review on my website or on Apple Podcasts. If you're looking for opportunities to optimize your brain health or unchain your pain from a past trauma, make sure you visit my website www.ruthmaryallen.com and use the code podcast10 at checkout to get 10% off all programs. And always remember, you are not stuck with the brain you have. You have the power to make it better. You have the power to unchain your pain and optimize your brain power and performance so that you can win back energy and time doing what you love.
Each episode of Brain Health Unchaining Your Pain with Dr. Ruth Allan is for educational and demonstration purposes only. The information shared in each episode should not be interpreted as medical advice. This episode should not be used to self-diagnose or self-treat any health, medical or physical condition. Do not use this episode to avoid going to your healthcare professional or to replace the advice they give you. Consult with a trusted healthcare professional before doing anything contained in this episode. If you have any questions or concerns, please contact www.ruthmaryallen.com/connect.